I say welcome to all of you that I see and I don't see. That's a kind of very strange thing with the screen. So this session is about ethnography research. First, an overall presentation about Strength2Food project, where I will say a few words about what we have been doing very generally. Then Gun and Mathieu will have insights from different parts of the work we have been doing. And then we give the screen and the words to two other projects. Wilde Huigrening will speak about the West textiles, where they are also using ethnographic research. And Roberta Deschetti is here also with us about ethnographic approaches. So I will begin with our project, which is a Strength2Food project. It's interesting to know that actually we had a consumer part, and Matt was speaking a little bit about this, especially saying that consumers have a very low knowledge about food quality schemes. But in the consumer part, we had a quantitative approach and a qualitative approach. Usually, qualitative approaches are to prepare the quantitative one. But in Strength2Food, we were very lucky and we could have our own qualitative approach with one aim, and it was to better understand consumer practices concerning food quality schemes. So why ethnographic approach, ethnographic research? Because by this ethnographic way or lens, we can understand and see people's habits, culture, what we call practices also, and have another way to see the link between everyday food consumption and food quality schemes. This work is based on three pillars. The first one is everyday food consumption practices and food quality schemes. That is our aim, or research question in very short way. And then we build on the four main consumption phases: to plan, to purchase, to use, and to throw away. The other pillar is a theoretical framework. We have chosen two: social practice theory and what we call social pragmatic sociology or conventions theory. And then the third pillar is the fieldwork. And that's what we are mostly speaking about today. This fieldwork, if I stay to figure, 7 countries. So you have the countries here, 6 households in each country. We try to follow them with 3 visits, if possible, at 3 different times, seasons. So we have different approaches to what you are buying when you choose maybe food quality schemes. That means, in a certain way, about 20 people, 20 researchers involved in this work. And I would like here to thank all of you who have been participating in this research field work, because it was extremely exciting to work with you. So this is most collective work than an individual one. Now I give the word to Gun, who will speak about insights in our ethnographic approach.
Thank you. To do fieldwork requires time and resources, and it produces a lot of data. But today, then I've selected to share with you 3 insights from our comparative ethnographic fieldwork among consumers. So I'm not having any slides to show you. I'm just going to try to give you these 3 insights that I think are some of the important insights that we got from this work. First, experiencing together. As part of the fieldwork, we joined our informants on grocery shopping to observe the interactions between them and the food in the marketplace. But in addition to that, we spent time in their homes. We observed and recorded dinner preparation. We ate dinner with them. We participated in cleaning up. And our focus was on experiencing food consumption together with the households and listening to them and observing what they were doing. We did this to better understand the complexity of food practices and the use or non-use of food quality schemes, organic food, local food, and short food supply chains. Second, we noted actually very little use of food quality labels in the households. And I think that the comparative approach allowed us to discover that labels were seldom used when purchasing food, both in countries with many and also with few food quality scheme products. So there didn't seem to be a big difference then. We observed that food shopping seemed to be a routinized practice that leaves little room for reflecting about, for example, food quality schemes in the grocery store. But we saw that the households, they did purchase some of these products, and also they had some of these type of quality labels in products with that in their kitchens, although they rarely brought that up or commented on this. So I think that this, we can call it disinterest among our informants, persisted. We could also see that persisted over time, because what we did was that we visited the household 3 times in 3 different seasons, and on each of these occasions we asked them about labels, but still they didn't express much interest in the topic after all our efforts to bring this up. My last point, the third point that I wish to bring up, is the value of using a variety of methods, such as observation, interviews, walk-alongs, photo diaries, and video documentation. This allowed us to be more material and also get insight into people's everyday lives and practices, also practices that they were not consciously aware of. For example, although the households rarely talked about sustainable food practices, some of the food practices that we observed do contribute to sustainability. Some talked about that they disliked the excessive use of plastic in food packaging. Some avoided wasting food and made use of leftovers. And in some countries, gardening and self-production played an important role. And these are some of the images of all these activities and practices you can see in the ethnographic field gallery, which you find among the tools and resources presented at this final conference. So that was the 3 insights I wanted to bring to you today about our fieldwork.
I take the...
I don't need to give the word to you, Mathieu, but
okay. So
maybe just to explain what you are saying, because I forgot to tell it. So just when we went in the mixed method, we had first a semi-structured interview at the first visit with a food basket with labels. Okay. And at the last visit, we had what Mathieu will speak about, that we call a dialogic conversation. So Mathieu is taking over now.
Yes. So as Gun and Virginie had just mentioned, the ethnographic protocol comprised 3 stages, 3 interviews, and one of them was the dialogical conversations. The objective of this dialogical conversation, by going back to the family on their first interviews, was to take into account how participation in the studies had or had not led to changes or reflections in food habits. In other words, to try to capture the reflexive and dynamic dimensions of behavior. This is very important and relevant when we are trying to work on sustainable eating behaviors. Furthermore, the aim was to establish an open dialogue, trying to erase the asymmetries inherent in an interview's situations. To be honest, these 2 ambitious objectives were not always achieved. Nevertheless, I would retain 2 elements that seems particularly rich in the use of this protocol. The first is that it enables us to deepen the practices and representations of the families. The long-term nature of the relationships, by encouraging mutual knowledge and trust, was important from this point of view. The fact that the discussion was based on a previous interview also played an important role. It allowed the family to return to some of their practices, to discuss them in more detail, and to qualify them. Thus, we had access to rich materials revealing the complexity of eating behaviors. The second, which is not specifically related to dialogical conversations, is that the implementation of this protocol made it possible to set up an ethnographic approach in 7 countries with teams that were not all familiar with this type of methods. Here, it is the CFO teams that must be thanked. In this way, each country was able to carry out in-depth ethnographic work, of which dialogical conversation was a central part, and we were able to have a comparative approach. I could be wrong, but I don't think I know studies that compare so many ethnographic fields that using the same method. This is a methodological fit and of great interest for the scientific approach of eating behavior. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mathieu, both for your nice presentation and your kind words. I see that time is running, even if we began at 11:01. So, Vilde, I give you the word, and you will speak about a completely different project, even if you have actually been working on the Strength2Food project with Gunnar and myself. So, Vilde.
Yes, thank you. It's fun to be here at the final conference. I will not talk about wasted textiles as Virginie anticipated, but I will talk about the wardrobe method, which we will use in the wasted textile project and also in other clothing projects that we have going on at the moment. So, I did my master thesis on the ethnographic fieldwork that Virginie and Mathieu just mentioned. So I will try to connect this to the wardrobe method, which has been developed by my colleagues at CFO who do research on clothing consumption from an everyday life perspective, which means that the method revolves around the materiality of clothing and everyday practices, which means that social practice theory is the main theoretical framework. And in wardrobe studies, the garment is the analytical unit, and its history, use, value, shape, wear, and material are subject to systematic analysis. So the wardrobe refers to all the clothing a person owns or has access to, and it can be quite complicated to get an overview of. And the wardrobes consist of both active and passive garments and various garment categories and clothing for different occasions and different seasons. And also the infrastructure of wardrobes can be quite chaotic, as you see in these pictures. But the approach is to analyze the relationship between clothes, how they relate to each other, and between the clothes and the user. So there are several ways of applying wardrobe studies. It's not a singular method, it's a number of methods, actually. And some of these have been synthesized in a book called Opening Up the Wardrobe. And it has been applied to investigate clothing disposal practices from an environmental perspective. And in this case, the informants were asked to keep track of all the garments that they no longer use. And this approach involved a semi-structured interview, so it's kind of a mixed method approach about clothing practices and laundering and specifically questions why clothing go out of use and different ways of disposing of garments. And following such an interview, it's possible to do an inventory of some selected clothing from the wardrobe. it's very time consuming to actually track and do a full inventory of every informant wardrobe, because it can be quite some amount of garments. So it's very good to find some specific items to focus on. And what we also have done is we have tried to illustrate the wardrobe method in this figure here. And it's possible to think that you can focus only on one of these occasions. We have this box of occasions for different activities where we might use clothing. And it could also be possible to just focus on home office clothing or office work. And also to see how the garment has this kind of flow of being worn to an occasion and going back into the wardrobe. And sometimes it goes back to the wardrobe through laundering and then finally end up somewhere else. So it's also possible to look at this as a timeline where there's different points where you could study the specific user and the garments. But it's also possible to apply the wardrobe method to other objects than clothing. I think that's an interesting idea to see how it can fit with studies of food consumption. And it has actually been applied to fridge studies to study food waste and food consumption. And it may also be used as a method to kind of unpack the practices we take for granted in everyday life, which I think is good to study current consumption patterns and how they eventually can become more sustainable. Yeah, well, thank you. That was very brief about the wardrobe method.
Thank you very much, Vilde. And I have to tell that actually the wardrobe study has also been one of the base of our decision when we made this ethnographic research. Now I give the word to Roberta, who will speak about ethnography that she used in her PhD, isn't it?
Yes, thank you very much. I also prepared a couple of slides that I'm going to share now. Okay. So can you see my screen? I cannot see you anymore, so I guess you can see me. Okay. So yes, I'm just going to present a couple of insights about ethnography that are coming from my PhD research. And during my PhD, I became increasingly interested in the way consumption has become digitalized. And so there is a lot of phenomena that link food and digital dimensions, for example, food blogs, digital food communities, applications for smartphones, networked hubs. So the digital dimension is increasingly infiltrating consumption. And what I really became interested into was this idea of digital food activism. So using the internet to try and change food systems through consumer activism. So it was really a blend of consumer activism on one side and digital activism on the other. And in order to study this phenomena, many different approaches have been developed. And digital methods today, as Vilde said, is before about wardrobe method, is really a group of methods. It's not a single method. And there are many different names for it. For example, cyber ethnography, digital ethnography, and nethnography. They have been developed. I chose to use nethnography, which was developed by Robert Cozinet, and today has become one of the privileged approach to consumer studies. And I'm just going to say a couple of points about what nethnography is and why it is a good method to study consumer behavior. And in the first place, nethnography is a digitalized method, so is the application of ethnographic methods to the study of online cultures and communities. So it is really suitable for study all those phenomena that are happening through online, so mediated by the internet. And in second place, ethnography is a standalone method. So it's based on multiple different data, so archival, elicited. For example, it's often coupled with interviews, and of course also fieldwork data, very much as with ethnographic research. And lastly, ethnography studies the collective level. So its unit of analysis is not the micro level of individuals, nor the macro of institutions or systems, but is the collective meso level. So it's really interesting to study, for example, consumer communities, consumer groups, and what I really was interested into, consumer activists. And I applied this method to the study of fair trade. We all know that fair trade is a well-known label in Europe, but also globally. But I was really interested in fair trade activism more than into fair trade consumption. And I started to study this group of consumers that actively campaign for fair trade. So they are campaigning to promote the fair trade certification and the fair trade label, but also to stop unfair trade, so to stop the exploitation of workers, as the signs in their protest say. And just to conclude, why did I think that ethnography was a really interesting method to study fair trade activism? Because consumer activism, I thought, can be categorized into online and offline, but also into visible and hidden categories. And offline categories are often the most studied. So, for example, events, protests, marches, these are a very well-studied dimension of activism and also consumer activism. But the online dimension is really underlooked so far. So I really wanted to explore the hidden and online dimension of fair trade activism, and I thought ethnography was a really good method for that. So this brings me to the end of the presentation. So thank you, and I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you very much to all of you. And first of all, because you kept the time. So we have a few minutes for discussion, and there are some questions. But maybe just to summarize here, we have been through different methods and different way to speak about ethnography, ethnographical research. And everything we have in common is maybe to try to understand the difference between what we call the saying and the doing. So that's a way to go in the doing. And of course, it doesn't exclude the saying. We speak a lot, but we try to get a little bit more. But I see in the questions that I have at least one question from Angela. I don't know who this person is. No, I'm joking. Angela, you ask, why do you think participants engage with some specific issues, for example, plastic waste, but not other, for example, food quality schemes? And you ask, what was it about those specific issues? So maybe I can give the words to, I don't know if somebody would like to answer. My first impression is that plastic waste has been extremely mediatized, while food quality schemes, not so much, not the same way. It's more unofficial marketing. And also, at least in the Norwegian case, there is a sort of incoherence. And especially people who are interested in sustainable consumption are shocked because food quality schemes, because organic food, for example, is more plastified than the other. So, but I don't know what you think, Gun, Vilde, Mathieu.
I can just agree with what you were saying. I think definitely there has been more focus on that, and that's why I brought it up as an example also.
Yes, if I can add something, probably FQS is not as seen as a whole. Organic food, for example, or PDO is not the same for consumer, and I think it was very clear with our approach. And to complete what say Virginie about organic, it's true that sometimes organic are not seems to be the best. For example, with plastic, but not only. Sometimes people think it's perhaps a little bit industrial. You have industrial organic, but so. It's why you have you can have difference, but I will not say that organic label was not used by our informant on our family. I think it was really clear that it was used, and it is probably the label that it's the must use.
Yeah, you're right, Mayu. You're totally right. It was the most well known. With fair trade, maybe that we didn't study.
Yes, fair trade too. Mm-hmm.
I just go back to the question. So there is a comment from Marie Brennan about the presentation of fieldwork. Fascinating presentation. Angela said that maybe we should go to famous people to to emphasize the FQS. I would say that's a very good idea. If that's it should work. But then there was a question about is this method, or can this method be used to look at relationship between stakeholder groups? Any comments here from Rani van Gompel? Or do we keep to individual and households?
I think this method could be used for several groups, and we do that with a little bit with hybrid forum. I mean, it was not exactly the same, but it was a relationship in a long time, because we have 3 hybrid forum, and it was with a stakeholder, and it forced researcher to have a strong relationship with these stakeholders because of the organization of the hybrid forum. I mean, it's not exactly the same objective, but it was a little bit. So I'm sure that we can use this kind of method with different groups on different publics.
I would agree with you, Mathieu. The hybrid forum was slightly different, but something like this. But what we could imagine is to have a hybrid forum where we have a closer a relationship to each stakeholder or to each person, and maybe actually have discussions. So maybe go to their home and I don't know more about their way of thinking, what they are actually doing, and then it will be quite similar. The hybrid forum was a slight version of this. No, I think we stop here because it was very interesting, I would say, even for me who knew a little bit of everything. And I hope that this will encourage other researchers to use the ethnographic approach, and not only to think that this is the beginning of quantitative survey, for example, of beginning of something. This is something that we can use. It's a very deepen. It's a way to deepen in habits and practices, and to really get information that we cannot have through other means of study. So thank you very much for being there today, and most of all, thank you very much for all you in the team 8-2 in Strength2Food.